Welcome to the Podcast Cafe, where we're serving up everything you need to know about podcasting, from tips, stories, and strategies for podcasters from podcasters. I'm your host, Hayleigh Hayhurst, the founder of Espresso Podcast Production, a full-service podcast agency helping business owners, creatives, and thought leaders launch and grow their shows. Whether you're just starting out or want to take your podcast to the next level, this is the place for you. Each week, we'll dive into practical tips, actionable strategies, and of course, stories from other podcasters so that you can build up a podcast that you love and that works for your business. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's get started. Welcome to the Podcast Cafe. Welcome to the Podcast Cafe. I'm so happy that you're here. Today, we're actually going off the grid. Today, my guest is Amelia Hruby, the founder of the podcast Off the Grid, a podcast all about leaving social media and still growing your business. Let me tell you a little bit more about Amelia before we go into the interview. Amelia is a writer, educator, and podcaster with a PhD in philosophy from DePaul University. Over the past decade, she's been a university professor, a community organizer, and a radio DJ. Now, she's the founder and executive producer of Softer Sounds. Since leaving social media in 2021, she's launched the Off the Grid podcast about leaving social media without losing your clients. On the show, she interviews business leaders and former influencers and shares stories, strategies, and experiments on growing your business with radical generosity and energetic sovereignty. I am so excited for you to listen to this episode, so let's dive right in. And if you want to listen to Off the Grid or connect with Amelia or myself, our links are in the show notes. Okay, grab your coffee and enjoy. Hey, Amelia, I am so excited to be talking to you in the Podcast Cafe today. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I always love to talk about podcasting.
Yes. And we were just chatting about how we're both podcast managers, and we could talk about that in a little bit, but you have an amazing podcast, Off the Grid. I'm a huge fan of your show, and when I reached out to you, like I said, I was like, oh, she's so busy, she won't respond. But here we are.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to be here. I definitely feel like so much of my business and my podcast have been built by just saying yes to connecting with people over and over and over again. And so when I got your invitation, I was happy to find time to chat.
Awesome. Well, since we are in the Podcast Cafe, of course I have to ask you, what is your go-to coffee order?
Oh, this is a great question. So I have two go-to orders. If it is like below 50 degrees outside, I'm probably going to order like a cafe au lait, like a hot coffee with steamed milk. If it is above 50 degrees, I am probably going to get a cold brew, ideally a nitro cold brew with as much caffeine as possible in it.
Yum. I'm a cold brew fan too. And sometimes even if it's cold outside, because I live in Seattle, and I mean, you know, in Nebraska, I'm sure it gets freezing as well. But sometimes I'm like, a hot coffee just won't cut it right now. Like, it has to be cold. My hand has to freeze off.
No, I love that. Yeah, I actually just made my switch this morning from cold coffee season to hot coffee season in my household. And I was kind of bummed about it. I was like, maybe it's just cold coffee all year round these days.
All right. Well, let's talk about your podcast, Off the Grid. I am really excited for the audience to hear a new perspective on podcasting. And honestly, when I say new perspective, social media hasn't been around forever. This is probably one of the most classic ways to promote anything is without social media. So why don't you start off by telling us your story of, you know, your business, your podcast, and really how Off the Grid became reality?
Yeah, so there are so many places that I could begin this story, but maybe I'll actually start it the moment I left social media, which was in April of 2021. So leading up to that, I had really focused on growing my Instagram platform. I'd spent thousands of dollars and many more hours trying to build an audience on Instagram. And I published a book with Andrews McMeel in October 2020. I invested all this time, money, energy around that and trying to get people on Instagram to buy it. And it sort of worked and it sort of didn't work. And that plus a bunch of other realizations around just my like emotional well-being and mental health led me to leave Instagram in April of 2021. And I launched Softer Sounds roughly like 3 to 6 months later. I think I registered the business, like filed my DBA in July of 2021. And I launched the website and started outreach in September of that year. So I was offline or off social media. I was very online, but I was very off social media and I was launching my business. And I found that time and time again, like people were happy to talk to me about podcasting, but they really wanted to know how I was doing all of this without social media. And so I believe it was March of 2022, I launched Off the Grid. About a year after I'd left social media, people kept asking me questions about it. So I was like, fine, I will make this podcast for you so that I can answer all the questions at once and send people these episodes when they ask me in the future. And the show began with a couple of like really core episodes that people still listen to all the time. I started with one about, I believe, the 4 myths of social media for small business owners. I did an episode on how I left social media and sort of a 5-step plan, reverse engineering my process. And then I shared an episode on 100 ways to share your work off social media, which is really like an invitation to get way more expansive and creative in our ideas around marketing. And honestly, I've just been putting that into practice since then. So now I've been off of social media for over 3.5 years. I've been running this business for a roughly similar amount of time. And I've managed to grow Off the Grid from this show, like in the first season, had like fewer than 100 downloads per episode to now a show that gets over 1,000 downloads of every episode and has really organically built such a like beautiful listenership that I'm so grateful for all the time. And it didn't require social media to build it. So that's kind of a summary of many stages of the story, but I'll pause there to see what's most resonant with you.
Yeah. I mean, we're going to talk about your marketing strategies of how you grow your show a little bit later, but I totally understand why it has grown so much is because your niche, like you found the people that you want to talk to. You speak directly to their problems and you went through it yourself. You experienced what it's like leaving social media and still having to build a brand, make money, all these things. And so you did it first. So now you can teach on it. And I think that is really, really powerful.
Yeah, thank you. I do think that I have listened to many podcast episodes from small business owners talking about leaving social media who have not actually left social media.
Right.
And I understand, like I talk about marketing strategies I don't really use. So I get that, but I think there is something in just like living out the sort of advice or guidance that you're offering. And I think that really resonates with people. And what I found is like the show, I would say maybe half of the listenership is off social media, maybe even more than half is still on the apps. But there have definitely been people who have felt like empowered and emboldened to leave social media after listening. And I really treasure those connections. And I really take that influence quite seriously, right? Like I'm helping people make a really big decision for their business and for their life. And it's important to me to be very nuanced around that and talk about all the facets of it. And I think that comes through on the show as well. And I also get a lot of feedback that my tone is just very like gentle, but also very no nonsense. Like yeah. I'm going to tell you how it is. I'm going to tell you like, if you leave social media, will you miss out on stuff? Yes, you will miss out. It's not FOMO. It's just actually missing out on things. And we have to recognize that. Like I'm willing to look the challenges of this in the face and talk about them and also bring this tone of like, but it's okay, whatever decision you make. Like, I'm not here to tell anybody what to do. So thank you for, reflecting on that it matters that I've had this first person experience and letting me share more about how I think about how that comes into the podcast itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm still on social media and I do get FOMO. So honestly, I'd probably never leave, but I do listen to your podcast because just because I'm still on social media doesn't mean the strategies that you use aren't better or anything like that. Like I've learned so much from your show on back to basics without these like big of course, your marketing strategies have strategies, but they're not like, okay, what am I going to put on this graphic? And how is this going to make my audience feel when they scroll past it? Is it going to get them in like that 3 second, time period that they have scrolling? So, really, you do teach a lot on your show, and I do appreciate that. So, why don't you describe your podcast in 3 words?
3 words?
3 words.
I'm like, could it just be off the grid? um, no, I mean, I think the show. Okay, I'm going to describe the tone of the show, not
perfect.
the content of the show. But I think that the tone of the show is warm. I think it's practical, and I think it's expansive.
I think those are great words to describe your show too.
Thank you. I've never tried to do that before until this moment in time. So, but yeah, I think that really like what I try to do is be the warmest version of myself. That sort of like gentleness that I mentioned earlier. And then I bring that sort of no nonsense of like practical approach to the advice that I give. But also I am not trying to be dogmatic or didactic. Like, while I do offer some guidance or my opinions or what I think is working or not working, I feel like in every episode I'm constantly saying, like, you have to figure out what's going to work for you. Like, I can't tell you what to do. There is no one size fits all advice in business. Like, I think part of the harm of social media for business owners and podcasters is that like we think it'll just work the same way for everybody, and we think it's the only marketing strategy or tactic available to us. And that's just like, neither one of those things are true. Like, it doesn't work for most people, and it's not the only strategy available. So I like to have that sort of expansive way of looking at it and bringing in strategies that are both, as you've mentioned, like tried and true from decades ago, but also things that are like brand new and different that people are trying for the first time now. So yeah, there's that really expansive range of things we're talking about, and permission to just like try it out and experiment with what feels right for you.
Absolutely. So when you started this podcast, like you said, it was because people were asking you all these questions, and you figured, okay, it's time to have a resource where people can go back and hear my story and kind of like binge listen to it, and they'll still interact with you, but not the same questions over and over. And I think that's a great reason to start a podcast. So I think when people are thinking of starting a show, either they're in that position where people are asking them, or they have this concept and they're like, I really want to bring this to life, but no one's asking me for it. And both of those have different ways that you would promote them and market them. But since you have the experience of people are asking you for this, and you're like, I need to create this in the world to educate people and kind of get them out of my DMs and into learning, right? Can you share a little bit more about what that process was like of, when you were getting these questions? Like, do you send them a link to your show now, or what was the launch process like?
I think for me, this actually gets to the heart of kind of my creative practice, which blends my like practical and spiritual approaches to my work. So, most of my creative sparks come from like ideas that I've had, or like things that arrive, and I'm like, oh, that'd be fun or interesting to do. But I typically don't take a big action on one of those ideas until I can identify some like resonance in the world around me. So people asking me questions about a topic is something that like shows me that that resonance is there. Like there is an excitement for me to share and say more about this. And sometimes like that response that I have is more like, well, this thing I really want doesn't exist, so I'm going to go make it. Like it's a response to actually like a sort of gap in the market, as they might say, or hole in the market. And sometimes it's a response to like an actual person or people asking me questions. But I really try to always remember, like, it's almost like I think of creation as a sort of like call and response. And so I like have to figure out, what am I feeling called to do? And sometimes I have to like kind of put it out there and see if it gets any response. Or sometimes like I'm actually like the responses come before I've even put the things out there through those questions, through that feedback. But I think in the realm of podcasting, this is actually really important, just to step away from my experience for a moment and like working with my clients. Like, it's never going to work if there's no resonance. Like, if you can't find something that people really are interested in and want to spend time with and want to think through with you, like, you can make a beautiful show that may never find a listenership because that resonance isn't there with the people you're putting it in front of. Like, I do believe there is an audience for it somewhere. If you're feeling called to create something, I think there's an audience for it, but you may not have found it yet. And that can be really discouraging, or it may not be at the right time yet. When I did the first season of Off the Grid, I'm jumping ahead again, but like at the end of the first season, I almost quit. I was like, I don't think people are interested in this. Like I was saying, I didn't have that many downloads. I was like, people, like I got some nice feedback, but there aren't a lot of listeners. And like, this is a lot of time and energy. And so I almost quit. But my friend, Taylor Elise Morrison, who I love, said to me, she was like, you are ahead of where other people are at. You need to give this at least another year, and people will be more ready to leave social media and they will want this resource. And she was absolutely correct, like totally spot on. By the time I went to make the second season, it really like the show picked up. So this like question for me really gets deeper into, does your work resonate and with whom, and have you figured that out yet? And do you have like a strong enough sort of premise in what you're saying? So going back to the beginning of Off the Grid, like how did the launch work? I mean, logistically, I came up with the first, I think 4 episode topics. I built the Leaving Social Media toolkit. I was like, I want to launch a show and this is strategic for my business, so I need to get email addresses. So I came up with the topics. I built the free Leaving Social Media toolkit. I recorded those episodes, put out a trailer, put out the show. And then I started doing interviews because I was like, well, that's what I had to say. So let me bring other people on to have conversations. And
so
like, I didn't think when I left social media, I kind of resisted making a podcast about it because I was like, I don't want my whole life to be about not being on social media. Like that doesn't feel interesting to me for very long. So when I made the podcast, like what became interesting over time was having those conversations. And then as I have the conversations, I have new and different ideas and I create more solo episodes. And also as I do this work of being in my business in a certain way, it brings up so much. So I've gone like well beyond the scope of your question at this point, but I think like for me, what comes up and what you're asking is just this sort of how to notice resonance, how to step further into resonance, and also to stay centered in like, this is what I feel called to create. And how can I find the group of people that really want and need this? And how can I notice if like maybe it's not resonating? And sometimes you're like, well, I don't care. No one needs to listen. It's what I want to make. Yeah. And then sometimes you're like, I'm not there yet. I need to like pull some things back and like keep iterating on this idea and keep figuring out like, what do I really uniquely have to say? Like, what's a clear premise for this? Because I do think that as podcasting has become more popular and as there are more and more and more shows, there's just less space or attention for the sort of like, I like to have a podcast where I have conversations with my friends that kind of meander and there's no clear topic or reason to gather around them. Like I work with some legacy podcasters who do not do that, but like we've had to work harder to just hone and finesse and get clearer and clearer and clearer on the premise of their show so that they can gain an audience. But
yeah, totally. I find that a lot too, because I work with businesses and brands, and a lot of the time they'll come to me with a concept, and while it's good, they don't have their niche set yet. Like, who are you talking to? Who is it that's listening? Because I'm sure you see this a lot because you work with clients as well as a podcast producer. You have to kind of talk to them about like, think about your listeners when you're recording. Of course, talk about what you want to talk about, but make sure it resonates with them, because if it doesn't, they won't come back, Like your show, people know what to expect off the grid, like off social media, right? And so if you suddenly had an episode about, here's why social media might actually not be that bad, people might be like, Amelia, are you okay over there? Like, So really understanding them, and the whole point of the show is so important, especially when you are building a niche show like yours.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that knowing, like what's true to you and what's true for your listeners, and then also knowing how to share that in a way that is, going back to those tone words I used for my show, like I'm never trying to make people feel bad about the decisions they're making or being on social media. So having this way of like having a very clear point of view, but being open enough to welcome in people who may have different practices. But I also think something I've noticed in podcasting is that a lot of the most popular shows are like what I would call legacy shows. They've been around for over 5 years. Like they have a broad general audience, right? We have shows like Ologies or even newer shows like Normal Gossip. You know, it's not like there's one type of person. Like I think with some of these more popular shows, they're not as niched down and they have this broader appeal, but also they typically have like a lot of ad money behind them, or they started building before podcasts were as popular. And so their audience like has stayed with them and keeps growing and is not as susceptible to being like pulled by the noise. And so I agree with you completely. Like when I have clients creating new shows now, sometimes they'll come to me with these concepts that are just like huge general audience. And I'm like, that's a cool concept. But the only way you're actually going to get that audience right now is to pay for it. Like you're going to have to do PR and promo and like pay for ads and all of the different apps and things like that to actually get in front of enough people. And then I think this takes us into the social media part of the conversation, but people think like, oh, well, I'll just put it on social media and then people like it can grow there. But that also doesn't work. Like right. you want it to grow on social media, you're going to have to put a lot of money behind it. So I think that there's a sort of misconception, like people will have like a favorite podcast that has a cool concept and they'll think, great, I can do that. But they don't realize the like real strategy and often money that goes into growing an audience in podcasting. And so for me, I've just opted out of growing that way. I'm not interested in growing a giant audience or being for everybody. Instead, I do what I was trying to explain before. Like I focus on being really specific about who I want to speak to and cultivating like a really deep resonance with that group of people. And really part of the way I do that is that I am one of them, right? Like I speak to my own experience, as you mentioned. I run my own business. Like I don't think my podcast would be as successful if I wasn't a full-time business owner and like thinking about this every day, working in it all the time. And also like there's a sense of credibility if people are like, oh, well, Amelia's making it work. And like not just talking about being off social media, like has a business that like does substantial to me annual revenue every year and like has a small team and like does all of that without social media. So there's a sort of like, I'm cultivating the resonance, I'm living it out. And the podcast is my way of like sharing all of that for a specific group of people, not just for like anybody.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Oh, cute cat. Yeah, I think that that is so important to point out. So thanks for walking us through that. And that brings us to what I'm really excited to talk to you about is how do you actually make it work without social media? Like you're saying, so many people, and it's one of my biggest pet peeves and misconceptions in the podcast industry is if you just plop up a social media page, Instagram, and it's like, I have a new post or a new episode. Cool. What's it about? Right? Like
yeah.
It's so much more than just like a new episode post. But like how do you make it work without social media?
Yeah. So, I really try to stay centered in the sort of adage of like, how do you grow an audience one person at a time? So like, how do you grow a podcast audience one listener at a time? And I really try not to take any listeners for granted without like, drilling into a certain type of like perfectionism that like really stresses over every single download or something. Like I don't go that far with it, but I do try to hold true to the fact that like any person listening is spending, this much of their time with this episode. And like, I take that seriously and I consider that like, I feel accountable to that. And in terms of how I grow the audience, I've tried so many different things. I've done so many different things. I'll tell you about some of them, but I will just say like what actually has worked is being in community with other people who have larger audiences than I did or do, and are very aligned with my values and my strategies, and them sharing the show and really like championing it to their networks. So pretty early on, or rather like, in the first season, I had guests on who were friends and shared the show with people they knew, like my friend Grace Allardyce, my friend Taylor Elyse Morrison, so many other amazing people who came on in season 1 and were like spreading the word about our conversations and about the show itself. And that helped grow it to some degree. And then I think when I got into seasons 2 and 3, there were just people who had much larger audiences than I did that started sharing the show and like really resonating with what I was saying. So, I am forever grateful to Cody Cook Parrott and Nicole Antoinette and the team at Holisticism for spreading the word about the podcast. And I think that another piece of that was not just people like people sharing my show was a big part of it, but also doing some like guest spots on other podcasts. So I was a guest on Holisticism's 12th House podcast, which I'm also the producer of. So it was kind of a funny meta moment. But when I was a guest on the show, like that is how Cody learned about my work and like really brought more opportunities in. I also worked with the team at Tink Media at the end of last year, and I did like a pitch session with them, and they pitched me to a ton of shows, and I got to be on a show that's run by like Entrepreneur Magazine, and I got to be in a lot of spaces I would never normally show up in, and that brought an influx of new listeners from other places outside my network. So to me, it's like I know what I do best, which is podcasting. And I really try to work all the angles of that. I like make my show as top notch as I can. And I can talk more about that if you would like. Like I have a very involved process. I'm really dedicated to producing a good podcast. So I make the show the best I can. I share it with people and ask them to share it. I'm always connecting with other small business owners and aligned creators who I think might be able to share the show. I'm pitching myself to be a guest on podcasts and showing up on other shows that have aligned audiences. And maybe what's at the core of that is like, I'm not afraid to talk about what I do and how great I do it. And I think that that's really hard to get to that place. And it's a huge block for a lot of people. Even my clients, so many of them will have a podcast that they never talk about anywhere. And I'm like, well, no one's going to listen to it if you don't tell them to listen to it. And no one's going to listen to it if you're like, I have a podcast, but like, I don't know, some people like it, whatever. Like you have to be like, I have this show. It is fantastic. I work really hard on it. I loved this recent episode. Here's the link to it. Like, that's kind of how I go through. I'm like very earnest, very honest, very enthusiastic about the work that I do. And I think it comes across in the show itself. It comes across in how I share about it. And that requires absolutely no social media. I don't need that at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Whenever my clients are like, how do I grow my show? I'm like, do you talk about it? Are you telling people? And normally they're like, not really. Okay, we'll start there. Like that's a great first place to start. No, I love that. And along with growing the podcast, you're also growing your own business, right? And so, as you mentioned earlier, collecting those emails from, free downloads, resources that you might create, that's a great way to then get them in your email, and then you can, send them newsletters with the episodes as well. So you're doing a lot of really, really cool things. And I appreciate you walking us through that, because that is what a lot of people need to do. Just collaborate, get to know some people, work with them, and then just go from there. And you mentioned your extensive podcast production process. Why don't you walk us through what that looks like?
Yeah, gladly. So mostly what makes it, what I like feel embarrassed saying every time I say it out loud is like, I listen to every single episode of my show 3 to 4 times before it goes live. So I record the episodes with the guest or myself, obviously. I edit it myself. And then typically I will let it sit for a day or two, and then I will like take it on a walk. So I know that most of my listeners, they're listening as they drive, as they do stuff. So after I've gone through the editing process, which is like a really deep listening experience, then I'm like, okay, let me experience this like a listener would. And so I like to like take it on a walk or go for a drive and like listen to the episode again. And then I will do like a final edit. And then if I feel worried or unsure about something, I will listen again, and then I will schedule it and publish it to go live. So I do so much listening. And most people will say like, I hate listening to my own voice. I never listen to my own podcast. I hear that constantly. And I like to say like, that's okay. You have to do what's comfortable for you. But I think it's really hard to improve if you're not spending the time listening to your show. And I think that people's standards for audio are just higher than they used to be. They want, and it doesn't have to mean that you have the most highly produced show or the fanciest audio equipment, but I think it's important to just do the best job you can do on your show and to take it seriously and like take the listener's experience seriously. And so that's really what I try to do in this process. So I think the extensiveness is like how much I listen. And of course, like, I do all the normal things like invite my guests and follow up and send graphics and all that. But it's really like I take the craft of podcasting as seriously as I take the content of what I'm creating. And I think that has been a real shift in the show between like the second, third, and fourth seasons. And I've gotten a lot of great feedback that people can tell that like the show itself has leveled up and is much more potent and poignant and powerful because I'm giving it that attention and care.
Definitely. I think that's great. And I do think that people should listen to their podcasts. Of course, I have a client who travels a lot. And so before she takes any flights, she downloads a couple episodes of her show, and that's what she listens to. And she once said in one of her podcast episodes, she's like, I'm not doing it to be vain. I'm doing it to, get better and
Yeah.
improve on myself. And she sometimes feels silly about it, she says, but like, who cares? I mean, you put this out for other people to listen. You should, that's the only way that you're going to get better. Like you're saying, if you don't listen to your show, how are you going to know how many times you say like, especially if you're not editing it? How are you going to know
Mm-hmm.
what filler words you have, or, if you enunciate things differently than you want to, or even just give the vibe of, to your audience that's different than what you're expecting when you're recording. So I think that's really good advice for all podcasters to take.
Yeah, I hope people will do it. And again, like you can recognize that it's uncomfortable or like you'll probably cringe at some point. Like I still cringe at things that go out in the final cuts because I'm like, God, I can't believe I made that joke, or like that feels probably embarrassing. But I also try to remember that like when I think it feels that way, typically that means it's a connective moment. Like I'm kind of putting myself out there to be like, does anybody relate? Does anybody
Yeah.
feel this too? Would anybody else make this joke? Like that's vulnerable. And so I think, listening back is vulnerable, but the more we're willing to be in that process with ourselves, just like the better our shows will be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What do you think has been the biggest challenge since you started your podcast?
Like, I don't know, everything. No, not everything. I think the biggest challenge for everyone typically is growth. Like, how do you get people to listen and keep listening and get more people to listen? I feel incredibly grateful for the audience that I have, and I feel so grateful that it's grown organically. And, you know, on the scale of podcast audience sizes, my like 1,000 downloads an episode is so small, but it's so big for me. And I have other shows that get like 20 downloads an episode. Like I'm a human being who has like 5 different podcasts, and some of them are very small and people don't listen, but this one has really resonated. And so like I want to say that growth is the biggest challenge, but I actually feel really grateful for how the show has grown and how dedicated the listeners are. And so I think often what my challenge is has more to do with just like energy, capacity, time, which is also a big challenge for all podcasters, I think. As I said, like I really put my all into this. I listened to every episode a lot. I'm like giving it all of this time. And sometimes I have to be like, okay, is the priority to get an episode out next week, or is it to like do that whole process this time? And sometimes I have to let that go and just be like, I'm prioritizing having a weekly show. I struggle to go on break between seasons because I'm always like, well, listeners want weekly. I think my biggest challenge is really that space between like my projection of what I think listeners want and what I want to create, and those gaps, and also the gap between what I think listeners want and what they actually want. Like, I think that's like where I can get really stuck. There's like this sort of triangulation that happens. That's like, here's what I think I want to do. Here's what I think the listeners want me to do. Here's what the listeners actually want me to do. And like, how do I navigate that at any given time? Is challenging. And I think that not every show needs to do that, but because one of my primary goals is audience growth, I'm like really sitting inside of that dynamic a lot of the time. And I am trying to grow the show even more. I'm trying to build this podcast into a business of its own that does make, relatively substantial money. And so that means I have to be doing a lot of different things at once around it, and just like managing all of that work and all of the perceptions and projections that go into it. I would say it's probably my biggest challenge.
Yeah, totally. I think that is, that triangle effect of like, here's what I'm creating, here's what I think they want, and here's what they actually want. But since you don't have social media, how do you collect that data?
So I keep a very close eye on my downloads. I understand downloads are a very imperfect metric, but they are the metric that I have. So I do look at both like how many downloads each episode gets over time, but also like how many downloads each episode gets, like how fast it gets to 1,000 downloads. So I'd say on average, it takes me about a week to hit that for each episode, but some of them are slower than others. And that kind of gives me information about like, okay, maybe this creator has a smaller following, or maybe this guest has a smaller following, maybe this topic is a little less interesting to people. I also really keep an eye on my backlist. So some of the episodes that I put out a while ago just keep like growing, 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 growing. So like noticing that and trying to bring those topics forward again, I think has been important. So that's one way I'm figuring out what people like. I also like, one of the reasons I say I feel so grateful for my audience is I hear from them a lot. Like, I don't think a week goes by that I don't get an email from a listener with a thought about an episode or a topic or something I wrote about in the newsletter. So I am always like receiving and responding to those and kind of mentally flagging like, okay, this really resonated. Like if I put out an episode and I get like 4 replies to the email newsletter that morning, I'm like, great, this really landed for people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes those episodes will get like fewer downloads, but I know they were super evocative for the people they landed for. And other times, like the most downloaded episodes will be like crickets in terms of people actually reaching out to me. But I'm like, this was downloaded 1 million times. Like where, so that's not always coherent. Like it doesn't always match necessarily. But I think that it has been like, I do keep an eye on stats, both like quantitatively and qualitatively in terms of how much people are engaging or interacting with an episode. And then the other metric there is just like, how much did I like making it? Like sometimes
That's so big.
It matters to me. Yeah. Like I have to stay true to like, part of my role as a podcaster is to be creative and is to be a creator. And so some things that I think are really important to create and do, I have to do them anyway. And sometimes they land and sometimes they don't. And the ones that land, I try to go more in those directions. But, again, in that like sort of triangulation, I have to like really stay true and stay centered in myself as well. Like that's really important part of the process.
Definitely. Definitely. That joy aspect is what will burn out. Podcasts take a lot of effort to create, recording, like you're saying, getting weekly episodes out. So if you don't have that joy, that's going to lead to burnout. And that's really common in the podcast world. So definitely track how much fun you're having when you're creating these episodes. So that's really great advice. Well, Amelia, before we get into my rapid fire section, I'd love to see if you wanted to talk about anything else. And then I also have one more question for you before we start that.
Yeah, I think something that kind of pinged for me earlier that I didn't get a chance to say was that the biggest lesson I try to teach my podcasters, folks who already have shows, and then I teach this in, I have a little DIY podcast marketing and monetization course at the studio, and it's like the core lesson of this. But what I'm always trying to help people learn is that there is a difference between marketing your show and promoting your show. And I think that, especially in the case of social media, most people are just promoting their shows. They are just telling the people who already know about them that they have a new episode. And that is good work to do because people will forget. They will listen to you once and they'll be like, oh, I forgot that show existed. And like the promotion is what keeps them coming back. So if, for instance, for me, I'm not on social media, but I have a weekly email that I send out. So everyone who signed up for the Leaving Social Media Toolkit, they hear from me every time there's a new episode. That is promotion. But marketing is how you get your show in front of new people. So all that stuff I said earlier about like being a guest on other podcasts, partnering with different creators who shared my work, like that's all marketing. And most podcasters that I speak to are not actually marketing their shows. They're just promoting them. And I think that if you want to grow your audience, you have to do both. And not every show needs a big audience. Not every show needs to focus on audience growth, but if you are feeling dissatisfied with the size of your audience, like I think the key is to turn to more marketing and to get really honest with yourself about like, are you only ever talking to people who've already heard of you? So I think that's like just the tiny piece of podcast wisdom that I like to offer or like to really foreground when talking about how to grow an audience without social media is that you have to like, in terms of not being on social media, you have to find ways to promote your show and to market your show without using social. And there are a ton of options, but like you need to attend to both sides of it. So that feels important.
Yeah, that's such a good distinction. And I agree with you. Not every podcast does do marketing, especially when you are a busy business owner. You're like, oh, I'll just post this on social media or, oh, I'll just, tell a few people about it. But being on other shows, doing that collaboration, that is all really, really great marketing advice. And so you're so
Hmm.
right. I see that all the time in this space. So thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Thanks
And
for
so my
asking.
question was actually going to be about what's one tip for you to give to aspiring podcasters? But I think that pretty much covers it, unless you have something else you want to share.
Yeah, I think that that is definitely my best advice kind of once you get your show up and going is like make sure you're doing both of those things. I think my tip for aspiring podcasters, folks who want to get into it is like yes, spend the time to get clear on your concept, your premise, your niche, but also just start publishing
Hmm.
and see what people like and then go in those directions. Like I work with way too many people who try to perfect the show before it ever launches, and you can't do that by yourself. Like the only way to improve is with listeners. And so you that's my biggest advice is just to like get the show published and out there and then keep iterating constantly from there.
Oh, that's so good. Just do it, guys. Just put your podcast out into the world.
You just have to try. It's
Yeah.
vulnerable, but you just got to do it.
It really is. Okay, well, I'm excited to get in this rapid fire section with you. I have 8 questions for you.
Okay.
Usually I'm too chatty to get through this without, with that rapid fire aspect, but we're going to try. We're going to see how it goes.
Okay.
Okay, so my first question for you is what's the first podcast that you listened to? Or what left the most impact on you?
I'm definitely somebody who came into podcasting through Serial for sure.
Mm,
So easy, like me and millions of other people started listening to podcasts when Serial got big.
I love that. What is your favorite podcast genre besides your own?
So I listen to three types of podcasts. One is marketing and business, which is my genre. The other is books, and the other is film. So right now I'm listening to a ton of book review podcasts, partially because I just launched a book review podcast of my own, but I just like love listening to people talk about books. So that's probably it for now.
Oh, very cool. I love that. Now, think about your dream podcast guest. Who would they be?
I feel like I have been lucky enough to already have my dream guests on the show. So, when I launched Softer Sounds, I had some dream clients in mind and I booked those clients. And then I had some dream, like many of them have become dream guests. So people like Cody Cook Parrott, Michelle Pelazan, like all the folks who I just shared as like champions of my work, like they were people I really wanted to be in community with and have conversations with, and they've been on the show. So I'm trying to think who else, like if there's anybody super high profile or something that has left social media that I would want to talk about. But also that's like not a great fit because I just talk to small business owners. So I don't know. That's a great question, but I'm just gonna sidestep it by saying I've already had my dream guests on.
That's amazing. Good for you. I love that. Okay, what's one podcast you'd recommend everyone listening to? You're like my 4 other podcasts.
No, not at all. A show that I really like that I have just seen be liked by a broad expanse of people is Normal Gossip, which is just like pure fluff and fun. But I
I
think
love Normal Gossip. That's like one of
great.
my favorite shows. Like truly, I love Kelsey and the work she's doing.
Yeah, they're just really tapped into something over there and it's really working. So I don't know if that's like a show I think everyone should listen to. Maybe my answer to this is actually like maintenance phase. Like so many people love that podcast. I love that podcast. It's all about sort of dissecting and breaking down diet culture. And I think probably literally every person in our culture could use a dose of that from time to time. So that's probably my rec from a like everyone should listen point, but like everyone should enjoy
Hmm.
Normal Gossip
Oh
for
my
sure.
gosh. Yes. I think, okay, see, I'm too chatty for rapid fire, but I think what Normal Gossip really has that makes them stand out so much is that you could talk about their episodes with anyone and you're like, listen to this funny episode I just listened to and kind of tell the story. And kind of like the way I found out about your podcast, Amelia, was I got coffee with a friend I met. It was like we met at a networking event. We got coffee. She's like, "Hey, have you heard about this podcast? It's called Off the Grid." And she left social media. And I was like, "No, that's so cool." And so that, sticks in my mind of this girl left social media. Like, how did she do it? Right. And
Hmm.
then with Normal Gossip, it's kind of like different industry, but kind of the same thing of like listen to this hilarious story. Like, can you believe someone did this, kind of situation. So
Yeah.
I think that's why one of the reasons, along with ad spend, is how normal gossip grew like to the level that it is now.
Yeah, it's also kind of meta, right? Because gossip travels really far.
Yes, it
And
really
so this
is.
is a show about gossip. So it's like intended to travel. And I also would say that like I think Kelsey and her team, like they are expert storytellers and they select great guests who are also all great storytellers
Yeah.
and can kind of go along in an improvisational way. And so I think there is a ton of craft to how that show is crafted. And also, like, it just taps into the very human desire to gossip a little bit. And also, I can't help myself but saying that the advice, like, I love the story you just told. The shout out, thanks to your friend for recommending Off the Grid. But it's just such a good reminder for every podcaster listening that if you cannot easily recommend your show and say what it's about and why people should listen, nobody else can either. So it needs to have, that's what a premise is that super quick, like, this is what it's about and why it matters or why you want to hear it. And the story you just shared, like, was a perfect example of like how my show has that premise and people get into it. And normal gossip, literally every story, like, I just want to be like, did you hear the fan fiction episode? Like, I just listened to that one. I was so into it.
I just listened to that too. That was so good.
See, exactly. It's that moment. That moment is like, every show needs that if you want to grow a big audience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No. Okay. That was a good side note for us to go down. I think that's really valuable advice. Okay. What is your biggest pet peeve as a podcast listener?
Oh, I'm like crawling into my shell right now. As a producer, like really poor audio quality, like I'm going to turn it off. I can't do it with people. And I think that just has to do with I've spent years training my ear to be very attuned. And so if a show has a ton of background noise or the volume's really weird or they sound like they're underwater, I just can't stick it out, even if I really want to hear what they have to say. And now that Apple Podcasts has introduced transcripts, so if there's poor audio quality, I just skim the transcript instead of actually listening. So I think that that's my biggest pet peeve. And then I want to have like a controversial not pet peeve. I am a fan of filler words. I cut them out for the studio all the time. That's part of the work I do. But I like to hear how people actually talk. And I think that a lot of filler word removal is tone policing. And I think that it's generally, like, frankly, a little sexist and a little racist at times. The way that we will pull out likes or pull out mouth clicks, like, we can think through the types of humans who we might think use like the most. They're probably going to be women, or, a sort of Valley Girl stereotype plays into gender. We can think about the ways that mouth clicks perhaps like might actually be a cultural linguistic way of emphasizing something. And so I try to be attentive to that at the studio. And I hate when people say it's their pet peeve because I just think that podcasting should be about how we actually speak, not about trying to make us all talk like we're reading a book. And so I am learning to embrace filler words, or trying to be out here saying, let's embrace them, but in high fidelity sound, please.
Yes. Yeah. We could do a whole episode on that. I agree with you. And I say like a ton whenever I edit my episodes. I edit a lot of them out just because how I think the listener wants to hear it. But in my day-to-day life, this is how I sound. You're going to have to listen to me say like a million times. I'm fully aware of it, but I just can't stop it. But no, that's such an interesting, I don't know if I've heard anyone really talk about it. So we're going to have to do a whole other episode on that. I feel it already.
Yeah, gladly. I mean, I would love to nerd out with you on audio editing practices, like podcast editing practices, and how all of our cultural biases come out in how we edit sound. And it's part of the reason I'm totally wrecking rapid fire. This is slow fire questions. This is a slow simmer section. It's part of the reason I started Softer Sounds, and it's a big part of the ethos behind the studio is really being a place where we have a different value system, we prioritize different things, and it is a soft place to land for so many shows that are not safe in other editing environments, quite frankly. So my embracing of filler words is a small piece of those bigger values and what I think is important. But yes, I think that's a conversation about the craft of editing, which is maybe not for the listeners of this show, but I would love, to talk to you about anytime as a fellow producer.
Yeah, let's do it. Oh my gosh, I would love that so much. Okay, my next question for you is, what's the best advice you've ever received about podcasting?
Oh gosh, I give way more podcast advice than I receive. I mean, I think it's some version of like no one's thinking about your show as much as you are. Mm-hmm. So because I am the person who's out here like listening to all my episodes 3 or 4 times, that's the advice I need all the time. It's like, great, you put a ton of intention to this. It's very well crafted. Now you need to back off, Amelia. Like nobody's thinking about it as much. It's really okay. So I think that's a piece of it. And then there's something around just like the advice I gave earlier around like just not being afraid to publish. Like you just got to put it out there. You just have to let people hear it. You just have to get that feedback, good or bad or neutral, and keep going. So I don't know if any of those are specific, but that's what's coming to mind.
I like those a lot. I love that. Okay, I have one more question for you. What is the most surprising thing you've learned about yourself through podcasting?
This is going to sound funny to say, but I think what has surprised me the most is how much I love podcasting. So I started podcasting by accident. I was an on-air radio DJ at a community radio station in Chicago, and they asked if I wanted to be the assistant features director. And I was like, sure, cool, why not? And then they were like, so you're going to make a podcast? And I was like, excuse me, what? I don't make podcasts. Like, I don't understand what you're talking about.
You're like, me? No, never.
No, I was like, I was going to do features. I didn't know what features was, but apparently it meant a podcast. So I never intended and set out to be a podcaster. And they kind of trained me in this and taught me how to edit audio. And then I started doing that freelance because I needed to make some money on the side of grad school. And then when I wanted to start my own business, I looked around and I was like, what's my most valuable marketable skill? And it was editing. And so I started the studio. And I think that what I have discovered is that like I actually really love speaking. And I think that I am my most like clear and coherent when I am speaking. And I used to be a writer for a long time. Like writing was my preferred medium and I wrote everything out. But there was something about moving into podcasting where I feel so much less constrained by, frankly, grammar and needing everything to like the process. I have a PhD and doing a dissertation broke me as a writer. And so I can't do it anymore without like my standards are all messed up. Mm-hmm. But now I love podcasting because I can speak and I can say evocative things. And if they land well, like that's all that matters. It's not about having the most like perfectly laid out argument for whatever I'm trying to say. And so, yeah, I think that the most surprising thing to me has been how much I love podcasting. And then, yeah, now that's why I have like 5 separate podcasts.
I love that. I love that. That's really, really great. Well, Amelia, I have had so much fun talking with you today. I have like 100 more questions that we could go down, but unfortunately we're out of time. So before you leave us, I'd love to hear, what's next for Off the Grid? What do you have planned? Do you have any exciting topics coming up? Really, what's next for you and Off the Grid?
Yeah, well, thank you for all your questions today. They have been like really fun and like invited me to say and share some things I don't really talk about anywhere else, which is always fun in a podcast interview. So what's next for Off the Grid? We are currently wrapping season 4 of the show. Like, what season am I in? Season 4, I believe. And that will be wrapping up. I'm not sure when this will air, but season 4 will wrap right before Thanksgiving in the US. And I'm going to take a little December break. And then at the top of 2025, I'm going to come back with a really fun series of episodes I'm thinking of as like your 2025 marketing toolkit. So I'm going to highlight what I think are like my three highest recommended marketing strategies for growing your business without social media in the year ahead. And I'm really excited to do that. I'm going to be bringing on a new guest. I'm going to be bringing back a guest, and I'm going to be resharing an old episode to kind of talk through these like 3 ways that I really see people finding success with marketing without social media. And then we'll go right into season 5. So then it'll be weekly episodes from there. Typically I run a season from like January to May or June, and we take a summer break, and then we do a short fall season. So I think that's what's ahead. I have a membership alongside the podcast. So the doors for that are currently closed, but they will reopen in the spring. And that includes monthly events and a portal full of courses for small business owners. So that's also coming up. And there's lots more in store for Softer Sounds and other things next year. But that's at least what's up next, like immediately for Off the Grid.
Oh, very exciting. And where can people find more about your business, Softer Sounds, as well as Off the Grid and that membership that you were just talking about?
Yeah, so you can find Off the Grid anywhere you listen to podcasts. We are on all the platforms. You should probably search Off the Grid, Leaving Social Media, because there are a lot of other podcasts about being off the grid, like meaning moving into the woods and digging your own toilet,
right,
etc.
Right. You're like,
that's not what I'm talking about. No, I live in a home with plumbing, etc. So search Off the Grid, Leaving Social Media anywhere you get your podcasts. And then our website is offthegrid.fun. And that's going to have the show notes, the membership, the free toolkit, all of that is at offthegrid.fun. And then if you're interested in learning more about Softer Sounds, you can find us at softersounds.studio. I have a robust free resources page on the website there. I also have a podcast advice podcast. So if you have podcasting questions for me specifically, you can reach out and I'll answer them in an episode of the Softer Cast. So yeah, there's lots of good stuff at softersounds.studio too.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining me in the Podcast Cafe. I've loved this conversation and I'm so glad that we connected because we're going to have a million conversations after this. I can already tell.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real treat to sip proverbial coffee with you today.
Thank you so much for joining me in the Podcast Cafe. I hope you're leaving with fresh ideas and inspiration to take your podcast to the next level. Remember, podcasting is a journey and you don't have to do it alone. I'm here to help you every step of the way. Let's connect. Be sure you follow me on Instagram at Espresso Podcast Production or visit espressopodcastproduction.com for more tips, resources, and behind-the-scenes insights. I'd love to hear about your podcasting journey. If you've enjoyed today's episode, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you're feeling extra generous, I'd love it if you could leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps more podcasters just like you find the show. Until next time, grab your coffee, keep creating, and I'll see you back here in the Podcast Cafe.